Hey there everyone, Ramesh here. Welcome back with another video. In this video, we are going to learn how to do validation in Spring Boot application. And we are going to use Hibernate Validator is one of the popular implementation of Java Bean Validation API in Java. So this is kind of a crash course. We will begin with a basic Java Bean Validation API and then we'll see the important Java Bean annotations and then we'll see how we can integrate Hibernate Validator in Spring Boot application. And next we'll create Spring Boot project and step by step we'll create one REST API and we'll see how we can validate a request, that is Spring Boot REST API request in Spring Boot application. We'll go step by step. So let's get started with the basics of Java Bean Validation API. Let's get started. Let's first take a look into Java Bean Validation basics. Alright, in Java, we validate Java Bean with a standard framework, that is JSR 380, also known as Bean Validation 2.0. Validating user input is super common requirement in most applications, and the Java Bean Validation framework has become the de facto standard for handling this kind of logic. JSR 380 is a specification of the Java API for Bean validation, and this ensures that properties of Bean meet specific criteria using annotations such as @NotNull, @min, @max, etc. So Java Bean validation is just a specification or a API, and we have some of the popular reference implementation for Java Bean validation API. So Hibernate Validator is one of the popular reference implementation of validation API. Alright, so this is the basics of Java Bean validation. Just remember, in Java we have Java Bean validation framework which we can use to validate Java beans, and Hibernate Validator is one of the reference implementation of validation API. Alright, now let's take a look into the important Bean validation annotations. @NotNull annotation validates that the annotated property value is not null. And @size annotation validates that the annotated property value has a size between the attributes min and max. And this annotation can be applied to string, collection, map, and array properties. @min annotation validates that the annotated property has a value no smaller than the value attribute. And @max validates that the annotated property has a value no larger than a value attribute. And @email annotation validates that the annotated property is a valid email address. @notEmpty annotation validates that the property value is not null or empty, and this annotation can be applied to string, collection, map, and array values. @notBlank annotation can be applied only to text values and validates that the property is not null or white space. So these are very important annotation we use while validating Java Bean properties. Now let's take a look into how to validate Java Beans in Spring Boot. Well, Spring Boot provides a good integration support with Hibernate Validator, and Hibernate Validator is one of the most popular reference implementation of Bean validation API. And starting with Spring Boot 3.2.3, we need to explicitly add Spring Boot starter validation dependency. Before Spring Boot 2.3, Hibernate Validator is automatically available whenever we add Spring Boot web starter dependency. But Spring Boot 2.3 onwards, we need to explicitly add this Spring Boot starter validation dependency. So remember this. Let's go ahead and let's quickly create Spring Boot project in Spring Tool Suite IDE. Go to the file, new, and then choose Spring Starter project. This is Spring Initializer which is integrated in Spring Tool Suite IDE. So let's quickly use Spring Initializer to create Spring Boot project, and let's use Spring Boot project name as Spring Boot Validation, and choose project type as a Maven and packaging as a jar, Java version 8, Java language as Java, and just give group ID as net.java guides, and artifact ID is same as project name, and just change the description like demo project for Spring Boot and Hibernate validator, and change the package net.java guides.spring boot. Go to the next and keep Spring Boot version as it is, that is 2.4.3. This is the stable and latest release of Spring Boot, and it is recommended by Spring Boot team, so let's keep default release of Spring Boot version as it is. And let's go ahead and let's quickly select Spring Web Starter dependency. So we are going to develop a simple REST API in order to do a validation in Spring Boot project. Alright, and let's go ahead and let's also choose a validation dependency. So you look at here, validation dependency, it provides a Hibernate validator internally. Okay, so before Spring Boot 2.3, whenever you add a Spring Web Starter dependency, then Hibernate validator was available automatically. But Spring Boot 2.3 onwards, we need to explicitly add this validator dependency to our Spring Boot project. So just remember this point. Spring Boot 2.3 onwards, we are going to add validation dependency in order to integrate Hibernate validator in our Spring Boot project. Alright, great. Let's go ahead and let's select H2 database dependency and also select Spring Data GPA dependency. Alright, now let's go ahead and let's hit finish. So this will create a brand new Spring Boot project in Spring Tool Suite ID. Alright, our Spring Boot application is created successfully, and now what we will do, we'll go to the build path and we're gonna change the default Java SE, that is 1.8 to JDK. Just edit this JRE system library and select JDK 1.8 and hit finish, apply and close. Now let's go ahead and let's quickly create few packages. So let's say controller, and let's go ahead and let's create one more package and let's name it as model, and let's go ahead and let's create one more package and let's name it as repository. Alright, and let's go ahead and let's create one more package, let's name it as service. Alright, now what we're going to do is we're going to create a simple entity, that is simple user entity. Right click new and choose class, and let's give class name as user, and let's quickly create private fields in this user class. Private long ID, private string name, private string email, and then private string password. Alright, now let's go ahead and let's quickly create getter setter methods. Right click, source, and generate getter setters, select all and generate, and also create a parameterized constructor. Right click, source, and generate constructor using fields, and deselect ID, generate, and also create a default constructor. So make sure that whenever you create a parameterized constructor, you need to also create a default constructor, because once we make this class as a JP entity, then Hibernate internally uses proxies to create object using default constructor. So make sure that whenever you create a parameterized constructor, you have to also create a default constructor, otherwise you will get an exception. Now let's make this class as a JP entity by adding @entity annotation, and let's add table annotation to provide a table information like name. Let's give table name as users, And let's configure primary key by using @id annotation, and also specify the generated primary key generation strategy by using @generated_value annotation, and specify the strategy, that is generation type identity. Alright, so if you don't specify @table annotation, then by default JPA not enough to give a table name as a class name, and we can map a field with a column by using @column annotation, and we can give a name to the column by using @column annotation with name attribute. Alright, if you don't specify @column annotation, then JPA not enough to give a name to column as a field name. Okay, we can remove this @column annotation, or if you want to make this column as not null, then you can just pass nullable equals to false. Okay, alright, now we have created a simple JPA entity. Now let's go to the repository package, right click, new, and choose interface, and let's give interface name like user repository. Hit enter, and let's extend this interface from JPA repository interface. Well, we need to pass an entity type user here, and then ID type is long. So JPA repository interface is a generic interface, and we need to pass two parameters. One is entity type, that is user, and another is the ID of type long. If you go to the user entity, you can see here ID, and we have added long as a type to ID, and this long type we need to provide here. Okay, just remember, whenever our interface extends JPA repository, we will get accrued methods for this user entity. And one more point is, here we don't have to add @repository annotation. Okay, we don't have to add @repository annotation to our repository interfaces, because Spring Data JPA already added @repository annotation to default implementation class of JPA repository. So look at here, simple JPA repository class is basically implementation of JPA repository interface. Alright, and simple JPA repository is already annotated with @repository annotation. Hence, we no need to add @repository annotation again to this interface. Okay, great. Now let's go to the service package. Right click on service package, new, and then choose class, and let's give class name as user service. Okay, and let's annotate this class with @service annotation. So when we annotate class with @service annotation, so this annotation will automatically auto detect this class while auto component scanning, and this bin will be registered as a Spring bin. And remember, whenever you create a service classes, make sure you annotate with @service annotation so that this class can be recognized as a service class, and we typically store business logic in service classes. Now let's go ahead and let's inject user repository here, private user repository. This is the field injection type. Okay, you can also use a setter or constructor. Now I'm going to create a method, public, and then user. The return type of the method is user. Method name is create user, and just pass create user, and we're going to simply return user repository dot save method, and we save user. Okay, Pretty simple, isn't it? We have created a create user method which will basically save a user to database and it will return the saved user. Basically this save method returns a saved entity. Okay, great. Now let's go to the controller, right click on controller, new, and then choose class, and let's give class name as user controller, and let's annotate this controller with @rest controller annotation. Okay, and let's also add @request mapping annotation, and let's specify the base URL for this controller like API, something like this, and let's create a simple REST endpoint, public response entity, and this is the generic type, so we can pass a user as a type, and the method name is create user, and we're going to pass user object as a parameter to this method. Okay, now let's annotate this method with @post mapping annotation. So basically we're going to handle a post request, that's the reason we're going to use post mapping annotation here, and just define the response URL users, and here we're going to use @request body annotation to automatically map a JSON request to Java object. And now before that, actually we have to inject the user service, right? Let's go and let's inject first user service. Now we're going to use user service object in this method, and then call save method or create user method, and then pass user object to this one, and here we get the result of this method in some user object here. Let's rename this variable, it is already exist, let's say saved user, and return new object of response entity class, and pass saved user object in body, and the status is http status created. Pretty simple, isn't it? So we use response entity class here to create a HTTP response for this REST API. So this is a handy class provided by Spring Boot, so we can use this class to construct a HTTP response for REST APIs. So always use a response entity as a response type to construct a HTTP response. Well, we have created simple REST API. Now we have created a simple REST API, that is create user REST API. Now it's time to validate the user domain entity. Okay, now let's go ahead and let's add bin validation annotation to name, email, and password in order to validate these fields. So let's say the client requirement to validate this name field is something like this: username should not be null or empty, and the second requirement is like username should have at least 2 characters. Okay, let's say the client requirement is like this to validate the name. So in order to adhere this client requirement, we're going to use @not empty annotation to check whether a name is null or not. So make sure that you choose not empty annotation from javax.validations.constraints package. Now this annotation satisfies this requirement. Now the second requirement is user should have at least 2 characters. So in order to implement this requirement, we're going to use @size annotation, and size annotation provides the attribute min attribute, and you can specify min as 2, and we can also specify the custom validation message like user should have at least 2 characters, something like this. Okay, great. Now let's go ahead and let's add a validation for email field. Let's say the client requirement is like email should be a valid email format. Okay, and the second requirement is email should not be null or empty. Okay, so now let's go ahead and let's add an annotation, that is at not empty annotation, and also the email field should validate the email format. For that we have at email annotation from javax.validation.constants package. Let's choose it. Now let's go ahead and let's add a validation for password. Let's say the client requirement for validating password field is like password should not be null or empty. So in order to do that, we're going to use again at not empty annotation, and let's say if password should have at least 8 characters. Okay, now we're gonna use at size annotation, and then it has a min attribute, and you can specify min equals to 8, and we can give a message here, something like this, the custom validation message. Password should have at least 8 characters. It's pretty simple, isn't it? Great. Now we have added all the validation to user bin. Now next step is we need to add at valid annotation to the user controller. So go to the create user method here, and along with at request body annotation, we're going to add at valid annotation. So make sure that you choose at valid annotation from javax.validation package. So this annotation basically enables the Hibernate validator and other Java bin API validations that we have added in user bin. Okay, so this is the second step. Make sure that you add at valid annotation along with at request body annotation in create user method. So we are going to basically validate create user REST API request. Okay, so only 2 steps. Once you create a REST API, then you need to first add all the annotations like Java bin annotations. This is the first step. Second step, you need to enable the annotation by using at valid annotation. Okay, that's it. Now let's go ahead and let's run Spring Boot application and let's see how it works. Go to the Spring Boot main class, right click, run as Spring Boot application. Alright, our Spring Boot application is up and running on embedded Tomcat server on 8080. Let's head over to the Postman client and let's quickly test the REST API. Let's create a new request in Postman client and let's type the URL localhost 8080/API/users and select HTTP method post and go to the body section and choose raw here and content type JSON, and here we need to create a JSON request, name let's say Ramesh, email ramesh@gmail.com, and then password something like password 123 and hit send button, and here we go. The record is successfully stored in a database, that is S2 database, and we got a response of the REST API. Now what we're going to do is we're going to validate the request. Let's remove the name and keep a empty value for name field. And if we hit the send button, and here we go, we got a response. It says that the bad request, and we didn't get a message here. Okay, so we have to customize the validation response. Okay, this is not a good appropriate response. So this is the Spring Boot default response for validation, but we need to remove this response and we need to add our own custom response validation. And if you look at the console here, we can see the messages, but in a response we are not able to see the messages. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a custom code to a validation response. For that, what I'm going to do is I want to create a new class, and let's call it as validation handler, something like this, and extend this class with response entity exception handler. And let's override one of the method. So let me show you which method you need to override. So this is the handle method, argument not valid. So this is the method we need to override. Just paste the method and hit OK. Now we have overridden the method, that is handle method argument not valid method. Now we're going to write our own custom logic here. Alright, so let me quickly create a map. We will return basically all the error messages to the client. For that, we can use a map to store key value pair, key as a string, value as a string, and errors equals to new hash map. Perfect. Now we have method argument not valid exception. Okay, this object. So from this object we can get all the errors. Let's call get binding result and then get all errors. So get all errors method returns a list, so we can use for each method, and for each method has a consumer functional interface. We can use a lambda expression here in order to implement consumer interface. Okay, and the argument here we can say error, and let's get a field name and a default message from the error object. So here I just cast this object with field error class. Okay, and now I can able to call get field method here. So this method returns a field name, and we can take this field name in a string. Let's say field name, and similarly let's get error message or the validation message from the error object, error dot get default message. Now let's put field name as a key and message as a value in map, errors dot put and key as a field name and value as a message. And now simply return new and then response entity object, and in a body just pass a map, that is errors, and status as http status dot bad request. Okay, that's it, pretty simple. Now let's go ahead and let's add annotation to this class, that is @controller advice annotation. So we use @controller advice annotation to handle validation and exception in a single place. Alright, let's save the file and let's go to the Spring Boot main class, right click, run as Spring Boot application. Okay, let's head over to Postman client and once again send the request, and here we go. We got a customized valid response, like username should have at least 2 characters and email must be well formatted. We have pass a wrong email ID and we have passed the empty value to null value to name field. That's why we got a response like this. Okay, it looks good, right? For each field we can see the validation message. For example, if I pass a name as A and if I hit send button, then I can able to get a validation message for name as well, like name should have at least 2 characters. And if I give a valid email ID and hit send button, and I can able to only get a validation error message for name only. Okay, looks good, right? I hope you pretty much understood how to do validation in Spring Boot REST API. Alright, subscribe to my YouTube channel if you find this video useful. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next video.